What if Geto had actually beaten Yuta Okotsu and successfully captured Rika? How strong would he have been? Let's talk about it. First off, shout out to JJ for the question today, and it basically boils down to this, right? We know that Geto's plan in Jujutsu Kaisen 0 was to take out Okotsu, capture Rika, and then be powerful enough to see his vision through, right? He even says that originally their chances are less than 20%, but if he got Rika, it would go up to 99%. And considering Gojo was in staunch opposition to what he wanted to do, Geto felt that having Rika could make him strong enough to challenge Gojo. So was he crazy, or what kind of potential would he have actually had? So let's first set the stage by just talking about how strong Geto is on his own, right? And you got to remember that he is one of 4 special grade sorcerers, and he's in some pretty elite company here, especially considering the fact that he is the only one of these 4 that doesn't have RCT and doesn't have a domain expansion, and yet still he is put in the class with them. Now, obviously, these aren't all equal, of course not, but still, that in and of itself is very impressive. And an important thing to remember on a meta level here is that Geto's story basically ends in Jujutsu Kaisen 0. Obviously, there are implications that stretch beyond that, but we know his life ends at the end of Jujutsu Kaisen 0, right? And Gege wrote that first, before JJK. So it was kind of like the pilot, if you will, and all of Gege's ideas weren't, fully coalesced yet. All that to say is that domain expansions probably didn't even exist in Gege's mind when he was writing Jujutsu Kaisen 0. So that's probably why Geto didn't have one. Because, Gojo, Yuta Okotsu, there are no domain expansions at all in JJK 0. These other 3 characters just eventually get them because the story evolved, right? So, if Geto survived through JJK 0, I think it's pretty safe to say that he would get a domain expansion at some point. But again, to cycle back to the front here, he is amongst these special grades without having one, or RCT. But again, if we assume that he's going to get Rika, that means he lives through JJK 0, right? So he'd develop a domain expansion, in my opinion, and he would develop RCT, but we'll talk more about that later in this video. But off jump, this man is no slouch to begin with. And that's because his technique, Curse Spirit Manipulation, is absolutely ridiculous. One of my favorites in the entire series. Not only because it's so versatile, but because there's no upper limit on this thing's potential, right? He could theoretically go out there and get millions of curses in his arsenal, just assuming he somehow finds that many and finds the time to go out there and consume them, right? There's no limit to this thing, which is why he was a special grade and why he was such a problem. In the Night Parade of 1,000 Demons, he unleashed an entire army to go out there and cause a distraction. And Kenjaku even comments on this later in the series, right? Saying that if he hadn't have had to have done that and could use his full arsenal against Okotsu in their fight, then he would have won. And I have no doubts about that. Okotsu's no slouch, especially later on in the manga. But at that point, I think Geto stomps him if he has his full arsenal. And that's not even to mention Maximum Uzumaki, right? Which Geto unfortunately never unlocked the true potential of. But we will later come to find out that it can be used to extract curse techniques. And I think this is something else that can be chalked up to the fact that JJK 0 was written first. I bet Gege didn't have the technique extraction element of this in mind when he was writing this originally. But a Geto that hypothetically survives through JJK 0 will ultimately figure that element of his technique out, and that again skyrockets his potential even further. And this is all before we even consider him getting Rika. So let's talk about Rika, the Queen of Curses, a title that's not handed out lightly. She takes Yuta Okotsu, a grade 4 scrub, no disrespect, all the way to special grade just off jump, just from her existing. We know that his ability to copy and store the curse techniques and his boundless, I repeat, boundless cursed energy are both the result of him creating Rika as this vengeful cursed spirit, right? So Rika is built different. There's a lot of statements in JJK 0 that we can directly point to for how strong Rika is. Gojo being unsure what would happen if he really had to fight Rika, how many casualties there would be. Rika being a curse that you can't just exorcise. You have to untie the knots of the curse. I don't want to put too much weight in either of those statements because Personally, I think Gojo slaps Rika. And again, we have to cite back to the fact that JJK Zero was written first, and Rika was like kind of the main antagonist in a way. Obviously, it was Geto, but you know what I mean? Like, she exists as this really powerful force that we're supposed to worry about, right? That's why the higher ups are worried about it. That's why we got to get Akotsu under control. She's presented as this, apocalyptic entity, right? So of course Gojo's going to have to be like, I don't know what would happen if I had to fight her, because that gives us stakes, right? I think Gojo slaps. Anyway, the fact that she can't be exorcised, again, I think she could be exorcised by conventional means, especially if we're going to talk about somebody like Gojo or like Sukuna. But again, these statements aren't nothing either. Like, she is supremely powerful just on her own, like not even talking about the abilities she gives Akotsu or would give Geto hypothetically. Just in and of herself, she is a special grade cursed spirit, just in terms of stats, right? Like strength, speed. Like, she's coming at you tough. It doesn't even need a sorcerer attached to her. She's gonna be a problem. So it's easy to see just why Geto wanted Rika so bad, right? Again, she takes a grade 4 Akotsu all the way to special grade. What does a special grade become? Special grade plus Ultra, Super Saiyan special grade? Like, it's ridiculous, right? And again, this is the true Rika that we're talking about. If JJK Zero plays out differently, Geto beats Akotsu, then he absorbs true Rika, not the shell version of Rika that Akotsu will later go on to get that has some limits associated with it, right? This Rika doesn't have those limits. Again, endless cursed energy, boundless cursed energy. That is an insane buff to give to Jujutsu Sorcerer. Again, Akotsu is the shining example of that, right? But start with Geto and then give him boundless cursed energy. It's crazy. And speaking of the copied curse techniques, we don't fully know the nuance of how that relationship is working. And what I mean by that is that there's still some kind of gray area on how the techniques are being copied, because in the JJK fan book, Akotsu's curse technique is listed as Rika. It's not listed as copy. So it seems to be some interplay between Rika and Akotsu that is allowing for the copying. And then obviously Rika is storing the copied curse techniques. All of this to say is that I don't know if Geto would necessarily get the ability to copy techniques in the same way Akotsu does if he were to get Rika, but it might not matter, because we know that Geto will have the ability to extract curse techniques with maximum Uzumaki, just like he did with Mahito. And Yuki does presume that he can probably only use those curse techniques once, but there's been no definitive proof of that. But let's just assume he can only use them once. Maybe it's a function of not being able to home too many curse techniques in your brain, right? So perhaps he could store the maximum Uzumaki techniques in Rika and use them indefinitely. Does it for sure work that way? No. But could he maybe even just get the normal copy like Akotsu? Maybe. So between these kind of two vague scenarios, it might be fair to say he could copy and store extra techniques very similar to Akotsu. But even if he can't do that, it doesn't really matter. Just if he can, it takes it to a whole other level. So let's just throw aside the copied techniques for a minute and talk about what the boundless cursed energy could give Geto access to. First of all, it would give you all of the normal things like we see Akotsu showcase in terms of cursed energy reinforcement and enhancement, right? He can be a demon with those things. But on top of that, he can empower his cursed spirits with cursed energy. And here, Kenjaku even tells us that he can enhance low-level cursed spirits to the point where they can take out grade 1 sorcerers. So imagine if he had endless cursed energy to enforce his entire army with. Just imagine an army of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of amped up cursed spirits. Who's dealing with that, right? And Geto doesn't even need to come. He can chill at home. But now let's just imagine Geto is also there. Oh yeah, and Rika. The levels are just ridiculous when you start thinking about the potential here. It is basically Geto plus Akotsu combined into one supremely powerful character. And if we want to assume he can copy the techniques as well, throw Kenjaku on top of that. So let's say Geto beats Akotsu and gets Rika. Was he right? Could he be successful? I think yes, if you give him enough time to fully realize the potential we've been talking about. Because it's gonna take time for him to figure all of that out, to get Domain, to figure out Uzumaki, RCT, and just everything he can do with this new power. If we hypothetically give him that time, I think he could do it, but I don't think he could beat Gojo. Now, I think he could still do it because Gojo can't be in a million places at once, right? He would be able to take out the non-sorcerers. But if it did come down to a one-on-one with Gojo that he had to do, I think Gojo still beats him, just because Gojo and Sukuna are so built different. But this version of Geto would be stronger than literally everyone else. That's my 2 cents. Be sure to hit me with yours in the comments, and thank you so much for watching.